Hey, good morning. Good morning, everybody. So, welcome to the online class lecture of Professor S.K. Paul, University Department of English, BRA, Bihar University, Muzaffarpur. Dear students of PG Semester 1 for CC2, Unit 2 of King Lear. So, you are welcome to my class. I am going to discuss today on the topic divine authority and kingship in King Lear. In King Lear. So this is a most debatable topic since years. So let me begin. Despite the 300-year-old debate regarding the lack of unity in the plot of King Lear, it is one of the most readable and gripping of William Shakespeare's dramas. The theme of filial ingratitude is presented clearly in the depiction of two families whom circumstances eventually bring together as the two narrative lines converge. King Lear is not only an absorbing drama but a disturbing one. So the beauty of diction and the overwhelming pathos of treatment given to innocence and goodness add to the poignancy of the emotional play. Like all great tragic dramas, the story of Lear and his folly purges the emotions by terror and pity. King Lear's first entrance in Act 1 is replete with ritual and ceremony. He is full of authority and assurance as he makes his regal way through the ordered court. When he reveals his intention to divide his kingdom into three parts for his daughters, he exudes the confidence generated by his long reign. The crispness and directness of his language suggests a power that, far from senility, demonstrates the stability and certainty of long unchallenged rule. From that point on, Lear speaks as king and father. The absolute ruler decides to apportion his kingdom to his three heirs as a gift rather than a bequest. In performing this act, which superficially seems both reasonable and generous, Lear sets in motion a chain of events that exposes his vulnerabilities not only as a king and a father but also as a man. Shakespeare shows that it is foolish to divest oneself of power and responsibility and yet expect to retain the trappings of authority. This is exactly what Lear does when he relies with ill placed confidence on the love of his daughters. He asks too much and he acts too precipitously, but he is punished by an inexorable universe out of all proportion to his errors in judgment. When he asks his daughters for a declaration of love as a prerequisite for a share of the kingdom, he is as self assured a parent as he is an overbearing monarch. He credits the he credits the facile protestations of love by Goneril and Reagan because they are what he wants to hear and because they conform to the ceremonial necessities of the occasion. Cordelia's honest response born of a greater love are out of keeping with the occasion. Lear does not look beneath the surface. He lets ritual appearances replace internal reality. In fact, he refuses to distinguish between the two. The, the aspirations of Gondril and Reagan soon emerge as the cynical conceits they really are. But by then, Lear banished Cordelia and the loyal Kent, who sees through the sham. Lear is successively and ruthlessly uh, divested of all the accoutrements of kingship by his villainous daughters, who eventually reduce him to the condition of a ragged, homeless madman. Paradoxically, it is in this extremity on the earth with Edgar and the fool that Lear comes to a knowledge of himself and his community with humanity that he never achieved while enjoying the glories of power. Buffeted by the natural fury of the storm, which is symbolic of the chaos and danger that come with the passing of the old order. Lear, through his madness, sees the common bond that connects him to the rest of humanity. The experience of Lear is on a more manageable human level, mirrored in the Gloucester subplot. Gloucester too suffers filial ingratitude, but not to one raised to a cosmic level. He too mistakes appearance for reality, entrusting the duplicitous Edmund and disinheriting the honest Edgar. But his behavior is more clearly the outgrowth of an existing moral confusion, which is reflected in his ambivalent and unrepentant affection for his illegitimate son. His moral blindness leads to a physical blindness when his faulty judgment makes him vulnerable to the villains. In his blindness, he finally sees the truth of his situation, but his experience remains that of a father and a man. Lear's experience parallels Gloucester's in that his figurative madness leads to a real madness in which he finally recognizes what he lacks. He sees in the naked Edgar himself a victim of Gloucester's moral blindness, the natural state of man stripped of all external decoration, and he realizes that he ignored the uh, basic realities of the human condition. His experience finally transcends Gloucester's, however, because he is a king preeminent among men who not only represents the hazards of kingship but also the broadly human disposition to prefer pleasant appearances to troubling realities. Because of his position, however, Lear's failure brings the whole political and social order down with him. Lear violates nature by a culpable ignorance of it. The result is familial nature, physical suffering, and existential confusion. brought low, Lear begins to fashion a new salutary view of himself, human love, and human nature. In his insanity, the result, the result is a familial rupture, a physical suffering, and existential confusion brought low. Lear begins to fashion a new salutary view of himself, human love, and human nature. In his insanity, Lear assembles a bizarre court of mad king, beggar, and fool that reasserts the common bonds of all men. Once he achieves these realizations, the play's evil characters, so carefully balanced against the good in Shakespeare's precarious world, begin to kill each other off and succumb to the vengeance of regenerated justice. It is, however, a mark of Shakespeare's uncompromising view of reality that there is no simple application of poetic justice to reward the good and punish the wicked. The good die too. Edgar finishes off his brother in a trial by combat, and the machinations of Goneril and Regan result in the destruction of both, but the redeemed Lear and Cordelia, the perfection of selfless love, also die. That Lear should die is perhaps no surprise. The suffering he endures in his confrontation with the primal elements does not allow an optimistic return to the normal life and prosperity. He looks into the eye of nature, and there is nothing left for him but to die. The death of Cordelia is more troublesome because she is the perfectly innocent victim of the evil and madness that surround her. She dies gratuitously, and not because of his any internal necessity of the plot, but because the message to save her arrives too late. The dramatist creates his own inevitability to represent the ruthless consequences of the evil and chaos that are loosed. When Lear enters with the dead Cordelia, he accomplishes the final expiation of his unknowing. Out of these sufferings and recognitions comes a new moral stasis. Nevertheless, the purged world does not inspire great confidence that it will attain stability in the future. When Kent, who is old, refuses kingship, Edgar assumes authority. But but despite his rectitude, there is an unsettling doubt that he has the force or stature to maintain the new order in the volatile world where evil and chaos always exist, not far beneath the surface. There is perhaps no play which keeps the attention so strongly fixed, which so much agitates our passions and interests our curiosity. The artful involutions of distinct interests, the striking opposition of contrary characters, the sudden changes of fortune, and the quick succession of events fill the mind and with a perpetual tumult of indignation, pity, and hope. And hope. There is no sin which does not contribute to the aggravation of the distress or conduct of the action, and scarce a line which does not conduce to the progress of the same. So powerful is the current of the poet's imagination that the mind which once ventures within it is hurried irresistibly along. So these quotes were from Samuel Johnson, The Plays of William Shakespeare. For its unsurpassed combination of sheer terrifying force and its existential and cosmic reach, King Lear leads this ranking as drama's supreme achievement. The notion that King Lear is Shakespeare's and by implication drama's greatest play is certainly debatable, but consensus in its favor and gradually coalesced over the centuries since its first performance around 1606. During and immediately following William Shakespeare's lifetime, there is no evidence that King Lear was particularly valued over other of the playwright's dramas. It was later considered a play in need of an improving makeover. In 1681, poet and dramatist Nahum Tate, calling King Lear's a heap of jewels, unstrung and unpolished, altered what many restoration critics and audiences found unbecoming and unbearable in the drama. Tate eliminated the fool, whose presence was considered too vulgar for a proper tragedy, and gave the play a happy ending, restoring Lear to his throne and arranging the marriage of Cordelia and Edgar, neatly tying together with poetic justice the double strands of Shakespeare's far bleaker drama. Tate's uh, uh, Baldur's Bowdlerization, Tate's bowdlerization of King Lear continued to be presented throughout the 18th century, and the original play was not performed again until 1826. By then, the Romantics had reclaimed Shakespeare's version, and an appreciation of the majesty and profundity of King Lear as Shakespeare's greatest achievement had begun. Samuel Taylor Coleridge declared the play the most tremendous effort of Shakespeare as a poet, while Percy Bysshe Shelley considered it the most perfect specimen of the dramatic exists in the world. John Keats, who described the play as the fierce dispute betwixt damnation and impassioned clay, offered King Lear as the best example of the intensity with its close relationship with beauty and truth. That is the excellence of every art. Dissenting voices, however, challenged the supremacy of King Lear. Essayist Charles Lamb judged the play to have nothing in it but what is painful and disgusting, and deemed it essentially impossible to be represented on a stage. The great Shakespearean scholar A.C. Bradley acknowledged King Lear as Shakespeare's greatest achievement, but not his best play. For Bradley, King Lear, with its immense scope and the variety and intensity of its scenes, is simply too huge for the stage. Perhaps the most notorious dissenter against the greatness of King Lear was Leo Tolstoy, who found its fable like unreality reprehensible and ruled it a very bad, carelessly composed production. that cannot evoke amongst us anything but aversion and weariness. Such qualifications and dismissals began to diminish in light of 20th century history. The existential vision of King Lear has seemed even more pertinent and telling us as a reflection of the human condition, while modern dramatic artistry with its contraptute, contrapt, compra, puntal structure contrapuntal structure and anti-realistic elements has caught up with Shakespeare's play. Today, King Lear is commonly judged unsurpassed in its dramatization of so many painful but inescapable human and cosmic truths. King Lear is based on a well known story from ancient Celtic and British mythology, first given literary form of Geoffrey Monmouth in his History of the Kings of Britain, circa 1137. Raphael Holinshed later repeated the story of Lear and his daughters in his chronicles in 1587, and Edmund Spenser, the first to name the youngest daughter, presents the story in the book 2 of the Fairy Queen in 1589. A dramatic version, the true chronicle history of King Lear and his three daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia, appeared around in 1594. All these verses record Lear dividing his kingdom, disinheriting his youngest daughter, and being driven out by his two eldest daughters before reuniting with his youngest, who helps restore him to the throne and bring her wicked sisters to justice. Shakespeare is the first to give the story an unhappy ending, to turn it from a sentimental, essentially comic tale in which the good are eventually rewarded and the evil punished into a cosmic tragedy. Other plot elements, Lear's madness, Cordelia's hanging, Lear's death from a broken heart, as well as Cain's devotion and the role of the fool, are also Shakespeare's inventions, as is the addition of the parallel plot of Gloucester and his sons, which Shakespeare adapted from a tale in Philip Sidney's Arcadia. The play's double plot, in which the central situation of Lear's suffering and self knowledge is paralleled and counterpointed in Gloucester's circumstances, makes King Lear different from all the other great tragedies. The effect widens and deepens the play into a universal tragedy of symphonic proportions. King Lear opens with the tragic turning point in its very first scene, compared to the long delays in Hamlet and Othello for the decisive tragic blow to fall. King Lear, like Macbeth, shifts its emphasis from cause to consequence. The play forgoes nearly all exposition or character development and immediately presents a show trial with devastating consequences. The aging Lear has decided to divest himself of kingly responsibilities by dividing his kingdom among his three daughters. Although the maps of the divisions are already drawn, Lear stages a contest for his daughters to claim their portion by a public profession of their love. Tell me, my daughters, Lear commands, which of you shall we say doth love us most? Lear's self indulgence, a bargaining power for love, is both a disruption of the political and natural order and an essential human violation in its demanding and accounting of love that defies the means of measuring it. Goneril and Reagan, however, Goneril and Reagan, uh, uh, vie to undo the other in fulsome pledges of their love, while Cordelia, the favorite, responds to Lear's question, what can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters, with the devastatingly honest truth? Nothing. A word that will reverberate through the entire play. Cordelia forcefully and simply explains that she loves Lear according to my bond, no more, no less. Lear is too blind and too needy to appreciate her fidelity or yet understand the nature of love or the ingenious flattery of his older daughters. He responds to the hurt he feels by exiling the one who loves him most authentically and deeply. The rest of the play will school Lear in his mistake, teaching him the lesson of humanity that the that he violates in the play's opening scene. The devastating consequences of his decision follow. Lear learns that he cannot give away power and still command allegiance for Goneril or Reagan. Their avowals of love quickly turned into disrespect for a now useless and demanding parent. From the opening scene in which Lear appears in all his regal splendor, he will be successfully stripped of all that invests a king in majesty and insulates a human being from first-hand knowledge of suffering and core existential truths. Regan, who joins her sister in further whittling down Lear's retinue from 100 knights to 50 to 25 to 10 to 5 to none. Ironically, in the language of calculation of the first scene, Lear explodes. Oh, reason not the need. Our basest beggars are in the poorest thing superfluous. Allow not nature more than nature needs. Man's life is cheap as beasts. Lear is now ready to face reality as a poorest thing. Lear's betrayal by his daughters is paralleled by the treachery of the Earl of Gloucester's bastard son Edmund, who plots to supplant the legitimate son Edgar and eventually claims supremacy over his father Edmund, one of the most calculating and child-blooded of Shakespeare's villains. Rejects all the bonds of family and morality early on in the play by affirming, "Thou nature art my goodness to thy law. My services are bound," refusing to accept the values of a society that rejects him as a bastard. Edmund will operate only by the laws of survival of the fittest in relentless relentless drive for dominance. He convinces Edgar that Gloucester means to kill him, forcing his brother into exile, disguised as Tom o' Bedlam, a mad beggar. In the play's overwhelming third act, perhaps the most overpowering in all of drama, encounters Lear, his fool, and his lone retainer, the disguised Kent, whom Lear had banished in the first scene for challenging Lear's treatment of Cordelia. The scene is deserted heath with a fierce storm raging as Lear, maddened by the treatment of his daughters, rails rails at his fate in apocalyptic fury. Blow winds and crack your cheeks, rage blow, you cataracts, you cataracts and hurricanes spout till you have trenched till you have trenched our steeples down the cocks, you sulphurous and executing thought executing fires want couriers to oak cleaving thunderbolts bolts singe my white head, and thou all shaking thunder uh, strike 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 flat the thick roundity of the world, crack crack nature's mold, all judgments is built at once that makes ingrateful man. The storm is a brilliant expressionistic projection of Lear's inner fury, with his language universalizing his private experience in a combat with elemental forces besieging divine justice. Lear is bereft and inconsolable, declaring, my wits begin to turn. His descent into madness is completed when he meets the disguised Edgar, who serves as Lear's mirror, an emblem of humanity, as the unaccommodated man, a poor barefoot animal. Poor naked wretches, wheresoever you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these. Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Take physic, pomp, expose thyself to fill what riches fill, that thou mayst make thee mayst shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just. Lear's suffering has led him to compassion and an understanding of the human needs he had formerly ignored. It is one of the mere moments of regenerative hope before the play plunges into further chaos and violence. Act 3 concludes with what has been called the most horrifying scene in dramatic literature. Gloucester is condemned as a traitor for colluding with Cordelia and the French invasion force. Cornwall, Regan's husband, orders Gloucester bound and rips out one of his eyes, urged on by Regan. One side will mock another, and the other too. Cornwall completes Gloucester's blinding after protesting servants stab Cornwall and is slain by Regan. In agony, Gloucester calls out for Edmund as Regan supplies the crushing truth. O treacherous villain, thou callest on him that hates thee. It was he that made the it was he that made the overture of thy treasons to us. Who is too good to pity thee? Oedipus like Gloucester, though blind, now sees the truth of Edmund's villainy and Edgar's innocence. Thrown out of the castle, he is ordered to smell his way to Dover. Act 4 arranges reunions and the expectation that the suffering of both Lear and Gloucester will be compensated, and the villainy purged. Edgar, still posing as poor Tom, meets his father and agrees to guide him to Dover, where the despairing Gloucester intends to kill himself by jumping from its cliffs. On arriving, Edgar convinces his father that he has fallen and survived, and Gloucester accepts his preservation, an act of the gods, and vows, henceforth I will bear affliction till it do try out itself. Enough, enough, and die. The act concludes with Lear's being reunited with Cordelia, awakening in her tent, convinced that he has died. Lear gradually recognizes his daughter and begs her forgiveness as a very foolish, fond old man. The stage is now set in Act 5 for the restoration of order, and Lear, having achieved the requisite self knowledge through suffering, but Shakespeare pushes the play beyond the reach of consolation. Although Edmund is bested in combat by his brother, and Regan is poisoned by Goneril before she kills herself. Neither poetic nor divine justice prevails. Lear and Cordelia are taken prisoner, but their rescue comes too late, as Shakespeare's stage directions state. Enter Lear with Cordelia in his arms, and the play concludes with one of the most heart-wrenching scenes and the most overpowering lines in all of drama. Lear, although desperate to believe that his beloved daughter is alive, gradually accepts the awful truth. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou'lt come no more, never, 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 never. Sorry. Lear dies with this realization of cosmic injustice and indifference. While holding on to the illusion that Cordelia might still survive. Look on her, look her lips, look there, look there. The play ends not with the restoration of divine political or familial order, but in a final nihilistic vision. Shakespeare pushes the usual tragic progression of action leading to suffering and then to self knowledge to a view into the abyss of life's purposelessness and cruelty. The best, the best Shakespeare manages to affirm in the face of intractable human evil and cosmic indifference is the heroism of endurance, urging the despairing father on. Edgar states in the play's opposition in despair. Men must endure their going hence, even as the coming hither. Rightness is all come on. Ultimately, King Lear, more than any other drama, in my view, allows its audience to test the limits of endurance in the face of mortality and meaninglessness. It has been said that only the greatest art sustains without consoling. There is no better example of this than King Lear. Now, kingship and Lear. Integrity, compassion, and justice are important facets of an effective king. The king is more than the physical evidence of a strong and united government. The king is God's representative on earth and as such serves as a model of behavior for all his subjects who look to their king for guidance, strength, and hope. If a king lacks the essential components of kingly behavior and the authority that these traits embody, his subjects will, as Goneril and Reagan demonstrate, turn increasingly to deception, treachery, and violence as a method of government. Does Shakespeare's depiction of King Lear offer the audience a portrait of kingship or, in contrast, a portrait of kingly loss? In his first scene, Lear initially comes across a strong ruler, although his plan to divide his kingdom among his three daughters seems rather short sighted and self serving. This decision places his two strong sons in law, Albany and Cornwall, in charge of protecting the outlying areas of the kingdom. But the single benefit derived from this division creates many problems. Lear is abdicating his purpose and his responsibilities, and he is also creating chaos. To achieve his goal, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia are forced into a love test to determine their inheritance. The division of any kingdom is not without risk, but even more, his action as has the opportunity to create adversity. Lear establishes a competition which complicates and already dangerous decision. Uh, Competitions, by their very nature, result in winners and losers. Cordelia loses when she refuses to play the game, but Lear also loses when he retires and abdicates his kingly role. He cannot be king without a kingdom, and the country, which is to be divided into smaller principalities, will not have the unity and strength to long survive as a separate units. Civil war and insurrection are the inevitable results of Lear's actions. The love test forces Reagan and Goneril into competing against the favored younger sister. Ultimately, deadly conflict arises between Lear and his older daughters, and the longest standing competition between sisters creates conflict between ruling factions, further dividing his kingdom. Even before Cordelia's return, dissent is in the air. In Act 2, Curran's report of a strife between Albany and Cornwall helps illustrate that Lear's division of his kingdom was a mistake. At this point, conflict doesn't appear to exist between Goneril and Reagan, and Cordelia is out of the immediate sense as a result of her banishment. Already, though Cornwall and Albany show signs of uneasiness, a discord with the clear potential to evolve into conflict and perhaps civil war. Goneril and Reagan soon unite against a common foe, their own father, but it is reasonable to assume that Goneril and Reagan, having disposed of Cordelia, would have next turned their and anger and anger against one another. Certainly, Edmund was counting on this event since he indicates he will marry whichever one survives the struggle for absolute control. Notably, King Lear was not always the ineffectual king represented in the middle and final acts of Shakespeare's play. In the opening of the play, Lear is the absolute ruler, as any king was expected to be in a patriarchal society such as Renaissance England. Lear enters in Act 1 as the king, evoking grandeur and authority, representing God and the reigning patriarchy of his kingship. The audience quickly forgets this initial impression because the love taste in all its absurdity forces the audience into seeing Lear as a foolish, egotistical old man. But the evidence of his greatness is seen in Kent's devotion, in the love of his fool, and in Cordelia's love, which is sustained in spite of Lear's rejection. By the time Shakespeare was writing King Lear, the English had survived centuries of civil war and political upheaval. The English understood that a strong country needed an effective leader to protect it from civil war and potential foreign invasion. The strong leadership of Elizabeth I had saved England when the Spanish attempted an invasion in 1588, and much of the credit for her success was attributed to her earlier efforts to unite England and to end the religious dissension that was destroying the country. No ruler would have deliberately chosen to divide a kingdom not after having witnessed the conflicts that had marked England's recent history. The division of a country would have weakened it, leading to squabbles between petty lords and the absence of an effective central government and a capable means of defense, having only recently achieved stability in their country. Shakespeare's Elizabethan audience would have been horrified at Lear's choice to divide his kingdom and so create disunity. The audience would also have questioned the choice of the French king as a suitor, especially as Lear intended to give Cordelia the choice center section of his kingdom. The audience's abject fear that a foreign king might weaken England and a Catholic monarch made it worse would have made Lear's actions seem even more irresponsible. But Lear is doing more than creating political and social chaos. He is also giving the daughters complete responsibility for his happiness, and he will blame them later when he is not happy. All of these events create a picture of King Lear as a poor model of kingship, one who reacts emotionally and without reason. Lear is very much loved by every good character in the play, with only those characters who are unworthy of kingship hating him and plotting against him. Goneril, Regan, Cornwall, and Edmund offer a contrasting image of kingship in their animosity and evil behavior that is brutal and uncaring rather than loving and paternal. One other important element of kingship is its connection to natural law and the image of kings as anointed by God. Kingship is directly connected to natural law, which is a central force in this play. A king has absolute authority and has no need to question natural law, and yet kings rule as God's representative on earth. Thus, thus their very position creates a reciprocal agreement between the monarchy and natural law. A successful king works in concert with nature as, as Lear does until the moment he disinherits his youngest daughter. In King Lear, the King of France stands as a successful model of how a good proper king should have. In his acceptance of Cordelia, even without benefit of a dowry, France is conducting himself with reason and conscience. he is also acting within the confines of natural law with a generosity of spirit and willingness to share his life and country. The model of France's behavior recalls how Lear must have behaved before his decision to divide his land. But instead of seeing this kind father and patriarchal authority, the audience witnesses an absolute ruler, one who refuses questioning or even the wisdom of his lords. Goneril and Reagan equate their share of the land with the absolute power of a monarch. They reject any allegiance to God or to any divine justice. Instead, they establish their own system of morality, one based on their father's law rather than natural law. Goneril and Reagan can be an absolute in their decisions as Lear chooses to be. Their behavior echoes his. In their choices, Cornwall and Reagan remind the audience of Macbeth and his wife. Cornwall and Reagan present a ruling couple, perhaps even more ruthless, but just as ambitious as the Macbeths, willing to murder their way to absolute power. Goneril and Reagan dismiss Lear's 100 knights, who are really his small personal army. Their action is reasonable if they expect to seize rule and authority. At the conclusion of the play, Albany appoints Kent and Edgar to restore order, although Albany's rank places him above the other two. But Kent intends to follow his master in death, and that leaves Edgar to inherit the kingdom. In spite of the recent events, Albany thinks that Kent and Edgar can rule jointly, but Kent is correct in choosing another future for himself. Although traditionally the highest ranking individual speaks the last lines in a tragedy, Shakespeare gives Edgar the final lines. Gloucester's surviving son responds to Albany's request. Edgar is clearly uncertain and reluctant to assume the crown. Kingship was never his goal nor his intent, but circumstances have forced him to consider a position un, for which he is unprepared. Shakespeare has not offered the audience much to appreciate about Edgar. For much of the play, Edgar was disguised as poor Tom, and the audience saw only a poor creature from Bedlam. Edgar really steps forward when he challenges Edmund, revealing that he has the goodness and strength to defeat evil. In winning their duel, Edgar's defeat of Edmund signals the triumph of righteousness over corruption and provides an assurance of God's blessing on Edgar. This act signals his ability to assume the role of king in Edgar. Kingship is exemplified by integrity, compassion, and justice. All the elements that Lear once possessed, but which were subordinated to his injured ego. So, dear students, I have finished my lecture. My lecture is over. My lecture is complete and it is over. Thank you.